The six-bedroom estate at 657 Boulevard stood as a pristine $1.3 million testament to the American suburban dream, until a single, unstamped envelope resting in its mailbox irrevocably corrupted its walls. Built in 1905, the grand shingle-style home in Westfield, New Jersey, projected an aura of absolute security, a fortress of manicured lawns and wraparound porches. Yet beneath its flawless facade, an unseen entity had already claimed ownership, transforming a sanctuary into a psychological panopticon. To the outside observer, the neighborhood was an idyllic tableau of affluent domesticity, where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets and doors were rarely locked. But the reality of 657 Boulevard was rapidly fracturing, secretly monitored by eyes that viewed the property not as a dwelling, but as an inherited obsession. The home itself was becoming a trap, silently waiting for its new occupants to step across the threshold. This sudden distortion of a coveted sanctuary set the stage for an unprecedented psychological siege. The nightmare commenced with a meticulously ordinary chore on a Tuesday evening in June 2014. Derek Broaddus, having just finished painting within the empty, echoing halls of his newly purchased home, walked down the driveway to check the mail. Amidst the mundane stack of bills and catalogs, his hand brushed against a thick, white, card-shaped envelope. There was no return address, no postmark to indicate a journey through the postal system, only a name scrawled across the front in clunky, thick handwriting addressed simply to the new owner. The physical presence of the envelope itself was an anomaly, suggesting it had been hand-delivered, placed there by someone who had walked right up to the property line. It was a seemingly innocuous piece of paper that held the power to entirely dismantle the family's future. That unblemished white envelope was the precipice of a descent into relentless paranoia. Unfolding the typed letter inside, Derek expected a customary neighborhood greeting, perhaps an invitation to a local block party. Instead, the opening lines delivered a jarring, chilling pivot, warmly welcoming the family before abruptly declaring that the house had been the subject of the author's family for decades. The writer claimed that as the property approached its 110th birthday, they had been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. The tone oscillated wildly between neighborly cordiality and an unsettling, possessive megalomania. The author, identifying simply as the Watcher, asserted a generational mandate, claiming their grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and their father in the 1960s. This was not a random act of vandalism, but a declaration of territorial dominion, stripping the Broaddus family of their rightful ownership before they had even unpacked a single box. The sudden realization that their movements were being catalogued by an unseen heir to a fabricated legacy left the family profoundly destabilized. Westfield, New Jersey, routinely ranked as one of the safest towns in America, a place where the illusion of suburban sanctuary is fiercely protected and highly monetized. Residents pay a premium for peace of mind, buying into an environment shielded from the chaotic unpredictability of the outside world. The arrival of the letter violently punctured this insulated bubble, exposing a terrifying vulnerability right at the center of their perceived safe haven. The threat was not external, but deeply localized, emanating from the very shadows of the idyllic street they had sacrificed to live on. Every manicured hedge, every curtained window in the surrounding home suddenly transformed into a potential vantage point for the anonymous predator. The geographic isolation that usually provided comfort now served to trap the family within a terrifying localized nightmare. This shattering of suburban invulnerability forced the family to view their affluent surroundings as an active threat landscape. A forensic linguistic breakdown of the letter reveals its most disturbing element, a phrase designed to inflict maximum psychological terror. The author specifically asked if the house had been filled with the furniture the family brought, or if they had brought the young blood that the Watcher had requested. In the study of threat assessment, this specific predatory phrasing elevates the communication from a mere nuisance to a targeted, menacing fixation on the Broaddus children. The use of the term young blood is a calculated rhetorical weapon, dehumanizing the children and reducing them to mere offerings for the inanimate structure. It implies an insatiable, almost vampiric appetite attributed to the house itself, animated by the obsessive proxy of the writer. This linguistic choice strips away any ambiguity, confirming a deeply disturbed psychological profile focused entirely on the most vulnerable members of the household. The predatory syntax transformed a bizarre neighborhood dispute into an immediate, terrifying threat to the children's safety. Gripped by a visceral panic, Derek Broaddus immediately contacted the Westfield police, seeking the protective intervention that the affluent town promised its taxpayers. However, the initial response from law enforcement was dangerously dismissive, shaped by an inherent bias that horrific things simply do not happen in their jurisdiction. Responding officers initially viewed the terrifying missive through a lens of extreme minimization, treating it not as a terroristic threat, but as a localized, harmless hazing ritual. The prevailing theory among the initial investigators was that a disgruntled neighbor, perhaps upset about the renovation noise or simply jealous of the purchase, was playing an elaborate, albeit cruel, prank. This flawed assumption drastically altered the trajectory of the early investigation, delaying crucial forensic analysis and allowing the perpetrator's psychological grip on the family to tighten. By framing the anomaly as a neighborhood dispute, the authorities inadvertently left the Broaddus family entirely exposed to an escalating nightmare. This early investigative misstep ensured that the unseen watcher remained free to operate in the shadows of the boulevard. Desperate for a logical explanation, Derek Broaddus reached out to the previous owners, John and Andrea Woods, hoping they could dismiss the terrifying missive as a bizarre neighborhood prank. Instead of reassurance, the Woods family provided a revelation that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the ordeal. They confessed that just days before moving out of 657 Boulevard, they too had received an unsettling note from someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letter delivered to the Woods had been similarly cryptic, thanking them for taking care of the property while noting that it was time for new blood to occupy its halls. Yet, the Woods had simply discarded the letter, viewing it as nothing more than an anomalous piece of junk mail from an eccentric local. They had lived at the residence for 2 decades without a single incident of stalking or harassment, making it incredibly easy to brush off the bizarre correspondence. The casual disposal of that first warning letter inadvertently sealed the nightmare for the incoming Broaddus family. This stark contrast in reactions highlights a profound psychological phenomenon regarding how humans process sudden threats. For the Woods family, 23 years of peaceful, uninterrupted domesticity created an impenetrable cognitive shield, allowing them to rationalize a singular disturbing event as an isolated anomaly. Their established baseline of safety neutralized the psychological venom intended by the anonymous author. The Broaddus family, however, possessed no such psychological armor, entering the environment as vulnerable newcomers with no historical baseline of security. Without decades of mundane memories to anchor their perception of the house, the terrifying narrative dictated by the letters immediately became their primary reality, transforming every creaking floorboard and passing car into a symptom of imminent danger. The house itself, once perceived as a pristine suburban sanctuary, was rapidly decaying into a claustrophobic psychological prison. Any lingering hope that the initial correspondence was an isolated prank was violently extinguished 2 weeks later with the arrival of a second, far more sinister letter. This new missive demonstrated a terrifying escalation, proving beyond any doubt that the author was actively and meticulously surveilling the property. The Watcher now possessed chillingly specific details about the family's internal dynamics and their ongoing renovations. The anonymous writer accurately identified the Broaddus children by their birth order and nicknames, explicitly mentioning a child who liked to paint at an easel set up on an enclosed porch. The letter taunted the parents, asking if they had found the secrets hidden in the walls, and demanding to know why they were changing the house from its original glory. This was no longer a vague threat. It was a targeted, real-time psychological dissection of a family under a microscope. The realization that unseen eyes were tracking their children's exact movements shattered whatever fragile resolve Derek and Maria had left. A profound, suffocating paralysis gripped the couple, halting all plans to actually move into the million-dollar estate they had just purchased. The grand, sprawling rooms of 657 Boulevard sat entirely empty, echoing only with the sounds of hired contractors who were entirely oblivious to the invisible predator lurking just beyond the property line. The quintessential American dream of ascending to a historic, affluent neighborhood had been entirely inverted. This paralysis tapped into the most primal, universal fear of the unseen predator, an ancient human instinct triggered when an environment feels hostile, but the threat remains entirely invisible. Derek and Maria could not walk the tree-lined sidewalks of Westfield without scrutinizing every passing neighbor, wondering if the friendly face offering a polite wave was the same mind-drafting letters of violent obsession. The inability to identify the source of the threat meant the danger was effectively everywhere. In response to the escalating terror, the Westfield Police Department initiated a highly classified investigative strategy predicated on absolute silence. Detectives instructed the Broaddus family not to share the contents of the letters with anyone, effectively isolating them from their own community under the guise of tactical advantage. The logic was that a tightly controlled flow of information would prevent the perpetrator from realizing they were being actively hunted. By keeping the details out of the local press and away from neighborhood gossip, law enforcement hoped the author would grow overconfident and make a critical, identifiable mistake in their subsequent communications. The police quietly set up covert surveillance cameras around the perimeter and began secretly analyzing the neighborhood's intricate social web, looking for anyone with a known grievance or an unhealthy fixation on local real estate. This enforced secrecy, while tactically sound on paper, inadvertently amplified the paranoia consuming the victims. Despite the meticulous covert operations and the silent dragnet cast by local authorities, the quiet strategy yielded a perplexing, absolute failure. The watcher continued to bypass every hidden camera and evade every police patrol, their letters arriving with an uncanny, almost supernatural punctuality. It was as if the author was entirely immune to the modern investigative techniques deployed against them. The persistence of the letters, entirely unabated by the heightened police presence, suggested a deeply unsettling reality about the stalker's proximity. The perpetrator was not a distant observer relying on occasional drive-bys, but rather someone intimately embedded within the immediate environment, capable of monitoring the police response just as closely as they monitored the Broaddus family. The failure of law enforcement to intercept a single piece of mail proved that the predator was already inside the gates. The affluent streets of Westfield, once a sanctuary of manicured lawns and predictable routines, rapidly morphed into a psychological trap known as a panopticon. This architectural concept, originally designed for prisons where inmates live under the constant assumption of being watched without ever seeing their observer, perfectly mirrored the sudden, terrifying reality for the Broaddus family. Every passing neighbor, every lingering vehicle, and every shadowed window across the street became a potential source of the malicious gaze. The luxury of the neighborhood offered no insulation. Instead, the dense proximity of these multi-million-dollar homes created an inescapable theater of paranoia, where the watcher could be anyone, hiding in plain sight. The most unsettling aspect of this suburban surveillance was the sheer impossibility of the perpetrator's invisibility within such a tightly knit community. Westfield was a town where everyone knew everyone, where deviations from the norm were instantly noticed and gossiped about over morning coffees and evening dog walks. Yet the author of these terrifying letters managed to study the family's movements, identify their contractors, and pinpoint their children's names without triggering a single alarm among the vigilant residents. This silent omnipresence suggested an adversary who was not merely observing from afar, but one who belonged to the very fabric of the neighborhood, cloaked by the mundane camouflage of suburban life. Beneath the canopy of ancient oak trees, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes turned the idyllic boulevard into a suffocating corridor of suspicion. Recognizing the devastating failure of local law enforcement's quiet strategy, the Broaddus family realized they could no longer rely on conventional police tactics to secure their safety. They initiated a drastic pivot, marshaling their financial resources to assemble a private elite investigative team that operated outside the jurisdictional boundaries of the Westfield Police Department. This shadow task force included seasoned private investigators and highly specialized former FBI profilers, professionals trained to dissect not just the physical evidence of a crime, but the psychological architecture of the criminal mind. Their mandate was to bypass the dead ends of the local inquiry and construct a comprehensive behavioral model of the phantom-tormenting 657 Boulevard. The methodology of these profilers involved a forensic deconstruction of the letters themselves, treating every word, grammatical quirk, and emotional cadence as a microscopic piece of a psychological puzzle. They analyzed the specific cadence of the threats, the archaic phrasing, and the underlying narcissistic rage that fueled the correspondence. This approach, known as psycholinguistic profiling, aims to extract demographic and personality traits from written communication, identifying markers of age, education level, and geographic origin. By stripping away the overt hostility, the profilers sought to expose the vulnerable, obsessive core of the author, hoping to map the contours of a mind deeply tethered to the history of a single piece of real estate. This aggressive shift in strategy transformed the family from passive victims into active hunters, systematically dismantling the anonymity their stalker relied upon. The conclusions drawn by the former FBI profilers painted a chilling portrait that shattered any remaining hope that the letters were merely a random teenage prank. The behavioral analysis indicated that the watcher was almost certainly an older individual, someone deeply entrenched in the generational lore of Westfield, rather than a transient interloper. The text revealed a profound, almost pathological sense of entitlement to 657 Boulevard, suggesting the author felt a rightful ownership or ancestral connection to the property that superseded legal deeds. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crusade born from a warped historical obsession, driven by someone who viewed the Broaddus family as illegitimate invaders polluting a sacred space. The profile further suggested an individual who was likely socially isolated, possessing an inflated sense of self-importance coupled with a deep-seated resentment toward the affluent newcomers reshaping their town. The archaic language and grandiose claims of a familial mandate pointed to a mind trapped in a self-constructed mythology, where they served as the noble guardian of a bygone era. This psychological framework made the watcher exceptionally dangerous, not necessarily because of a propensity for physical violence, but because their entire identity was inextricably linked to the psychological domination of the home's occupants. The realization that their tormentor was likely an aging neighbor, nursing a silent, decades-long grievance, injected a new level of terror into the daily lives of the Broaddus family. Armed with this psychological blueprint, the investigative lens sharply pivoted away from random strangers and locked onto the immediate, adjacent properties. The investigation rapidly zeroed in on the Langford family, whose imposing multi-generational home shared a critical property line with 657 Boulevard. The Langfords were a fixture of the Westfield community, having occupied their residence since the 1960s, a timeline that perfectly aligned with the watcher's claim that their family had observed the house for decades. The physical proximity was undeniable. Their vantage point offered a direct, unobstructed view of the Broaddus property, specifically the porch and the easel where the contractors had been working. This geographical advantage, combined with the behavioral profile's insistence on an older, deeply rooted local, made the Langford residence the epicenter of investigative suspicion. The circumstantial evidence surrounding the Langford household continued to mount, forming a compelling, albeit entirely indirect, narrative of guilt. One of the adult children, Michael Langford, lived at the home and was described by neighbors as an eccentric figure who frequently engaged in odd behaviors, perfectly matching the profiler's description of a socially isolated individual. Furthermore, the timing of the letters corresponded suspiciously with the family's presence, and the archaic tone of the correspondence felt congruent with the atmosphere of a home steeped in the past. To the private investigators and the increasingly desperate Broaddus family, the Langfords represented the most logical, geographically convenient answer to an otherwise impossible riddle. The sheer weight of this proximity prompted detectives to formally request an interview, dragging the eccentric neighbor into the harsh light of a criminal inquiry. The subsequent police focus on Michael Langford culminated in intense interrogations as detectives attempted to crack the facade of the prime suspect. Investigators pressured him on the astonishing coincidences, the shared property line, and the specific details in the letters that seemed to originate from his exact vantage point. They sought a confession, a slip of the tongue, or a psychological break that would finally connect the bizarre, threatening prose to the man sitting in the interrogation room. The entire momentum of the case rested on the assumption that this deeply idiosyncratic neighbor was the mastermind behind the psychological warfare campaign. Yet the interrogations yielded a deeply frustrating and perplexing reality that stalled the investigation entirely. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial alignment and the intense pressure applied by law enforcement, Michael Langford adamantly denied any involvement, and more importantly, his behavior during questioning did not align with the calculated, grandiose persona of the watcher. A deeper dive into his background revealed no history of malicious behavior or the sophisticated cunning required to execute such a flawless campaign of anonymous terror. The authorities were paralyzed. They had their perfect suspect on paper, but the actual man in the room lacked the psychological profile and the concrete evidence necessary to bridge the gap between suspicion and guilt. The collapse of the Langford theory left the investigation adrift, proving that geographical proximity alone could not unmask a phantom. The failure to arrest Michael Langford exposed the agonizing limitations of circumstantial evidence in complex stalking cases. In the realm of criminal law, proximity, eccentricity, and opportunity do not equate to a corpus delicti. There must be definitive proof tying the suspect to the specific criminal act. Stalking, particularly when executed through anonymous correspondence, is notoriously difficult to prosecute because it relies heavily on establishing a pattern of behavior and proving the specific intent to cause fear, elements that are easily obscured by a careful perpetrator. Without a confession, eyewitness testimony, or forensic anchors like fingerprints or DNA linking a suspect directly to the letters, the police were legally powerless to act on their strongest suspicions. The Watcher demonstrated an eerie, almost preternatural understanding of this legal threshold, meticulously avoiding crossing the line into actionable, physical violence or leaving behind forensic traces. The letters were terrifying, yet they were crafted with a calculated restraint, consisting of psychological threats rather than overt declarations of physical harm that would immediately trigger a higher level of federal intervention. This sophisticated understanding of the law suggested an adversary who knew exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage while remaining cloaked in the protective ambiguity of the First Amendment and circumstantial doubt. The justice system, designed to prosecute tangible actions, was fundamentally ill-equipped to combat a ghost who weaponized fear through the mail. As the legal avenues evaporated, the shadows stretching across the manicured lawns of the boulevard seemed to grow longer, hiding a predator who had masterfully outmaneuvered the law. The arrival of a third piece of correspondence shattered any lingering hope that the stalker had moved on. Mailed in late July, just weeks after the family had officially refused to occupy the home, the envelope bore the same distinctive, blocky handwriting that had already terrorized the Broaddus family. This new missive explicitly mocked their absence, taunting their futile attempts to secure the property from an unseen gaze. The author demonstrated a chilling awareness of the family's movements, noting that the house was crying from all the renovations and asking where they had gone, turning their deliberate avoidance into another twisted game of observation. The taunts embedded within this third letter triggered a renewed forensic push, forcing investigators to look closer at the physical evidence itself. The Westfield Police Department submitted the envelopes to the Union County Prosecutor's Office for advanced swabbing, targeting the adhesive flaps where the sender would have naturally licked the seal. The laboratory returned a startling revelation that completely upended the established psychological profile of the suspect. The forensic testing successfully extracted a partial DNA profile, but it was definitively and undeniably female. This single scientific fact fractured the prevailing assumption that they were hunting an older male patriarch obsessed with neighborhood legacy, throwing the entire investigation into a state of profound disorientation. This biological signature demanded an immediate and sweeping pivot in how detectives evaluated every resident of the boulevard. Investigators were forced to completely reset their parameters, widening the suspect pool to include the wives, daughters, and female relatives of the individuals they had previously scrutinized. Detectives began a meticulous reevaluation of the neighborhood's matriarchs, looking for any woman who harbored a secret resentment toward the newcomers or possessed a peculiar attachment to the grand estate. The process required cross-referencing property records with genealogical data, mapping out a complex web of female residents who lived within a direct sightline of the property. Every previously dismissed interaction or casual suburban grievance involving a woman in the vicinity was suddenly elevated to a potential motive for psychological warfare, as detectives systematically requested voluntary DNA samples from the women of Westfield. A darker, more manipulative possibility began to take shape among the investigative team. The perplexing mystery surrounding the female DNA introduced a terrifying question about the stalker's level of sophistication. Was the Watcher actually a woman harboring an unseen vendetta beneath a veneer of suburban normalcy, or was this biological trace a calculated forensic countermeasure designed to misdirect the authorities? Investigators proposed a chilling theory that the true author, perhaps a man, had intentionally used a female accomplice or even a stranger's saliva to seal the envelopes. This grim hypothesis suggested an adversary who was not just deeply disturbed, but methodically anticipating the police response, turning the very science of criminal identification into a weapon of psychological misdirection. The paranoia stemming from this potential forensic manipulation forced the family's private investigators to look for suspects operating entirely outside the traditional mold. Attention briefly shifted to a specific investigative avenue involving a younger neighbor known for his intense, reclusive lifestyle and late-night gaming sessions. Private security contractors hired by the Broaddus family tracked this individual's digital footprint, noting that his nocturnal wakefulness perfectly aligned with the presumed hours the letters were drafted and delivered. This theory posited that the stalker was not an obsessive historian, but rather a socially isolated individual treating the neighborhood as a live-action role-playing environment, projecting his dark fantasies onto the grand house next door. The suspect's proximity and unusual schedule provided a compelling modern alternative to the profile of a bitter, aging resident. Yet beneath the glow of monitors in the darkened suburban bedroom, the evidence remained entirely circumstantial and ultimately insufficient. The rapid collapse of the gamer theory mirrored the demise of several other promising leads, creating an agonizing pattern of elevated hope followed by profound, crushing disappointment. For the Broaddus family, every cleared suspect felt like a personal failure of the justice system, leaving them trapped in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. They were fighting an invisible ghost who seemed capable of slipping through every investigative net, leaving behind nothing but typed threats and a lingering sense of dread. The psychological toll of these continuous dead ends began to fracture their daily lives, transforming their dream home into a monument of unresolved terror. Driven to the brink by this relentless cycle of false hope, the family realized that if the police could not find the predator, they would have to trap him themselves. Faced with an invisible adversary and a stalled police investigation, Derek Broaddus transformed 657 Boulevard from a sprawling suburban dream into a hardened, heavily monitored fortress. The idyllic facade of the Dutch colonial was soon compromised by the installation of military-grade, high-definition surveillance cameras, meticulously positioned to cover every conceivable angle of the property. No blind spots were permitted, with lenses trained on the porches, the driveway, the expansive backyard, and the perimeter of the surrounding woods. Inside, the family fortified the doors, upgraded the alarm systems, and hired private security contractors to physically sweep the property, desperate to reclaim some semblance of control over a domain that no longer felt like their own. Yet, this impenetrable web of security would only deepen the terrifying reality of their situation. The chilling paradox of the surveillance system quickly became apparent as days bled into weeks, and the high-definition feeds captured absolutely nothing of consequence. There were no shadowy figures lingering by the tree line, no unfamiliar vehicles idling on the street, and no trespassers slipping letters into the mailbox under the cover of darkness. This digital silence was profoundly unsettling, raising a terrifying question that defied logical explanation. If the cameras saw no one, how could the watcher continue to reference highly specific, intimate details about the family, the ongoing renovations, and the precise placement of objects within the home? The absolute absence of visual evidence suggested an antagonist who was either intimately familiar with the camera blind spots or observing them from a vantage point completely outside their defensive perimeter. As the technological shields failed to provide answers, the psychological toll on Derek and Maria Broaddus began to manifest in devastating ways. Profound sleep deprivation hollowed out their days, replaced by a creeping, suffocating paranoia that transformed every passing car or lingering glance from a neighbor into an immediate existential threat. Derek found himself obsessively watching the camera feeds in the dead of night, his mind searching for patterns in the static, while the sheer terror of the situation left the couple emotionally paralyzed, unable to move into the house they had sacrificed everything to acquire. The American dream they had purchased had become a psychological prison, trapping them in a state of hypervigilance that was rapidly eroding their sanity. Pushed to the absolute brink of endurance and facing financial ruin from carrying 2 mortgages, the family resorted to a desperate, unprecedented strategy. In a highly controversial legal maneuver, the Broadduses filed a civil lawsuit against the previous owners, the Woods family, fundamentally shifting the battlefield from the shadows to the courtroom. The core of their argument rested on the revelation that the Woods had received a similar, albeit less overtly threatening, letter from the watcher just days before the closing, yet had failed to disclose this crucial information. The lawsuit alleged fraudulent concealment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, arguing that the sellers had a legal and moral obligation to warn the incoming buyers about the lurking presence obsessed with the property. This aggressive litigation strategy was born out of sheer desperation, an attempt to void the sale and escape the financial anchor that 657 Boulevard had become. The filing of these legal documents in the county courthouse effectively shattered the quiet, contained bubble of the Westfield investigation. The litigation immediately thrust the case into the complex legal territory of what constitutes a stigmatized property, a term used in real estate to describe a home whose value is significantly reduced due to a psychological taint rather than a physical defect. The courts were now forced to grapple with whether a series of anonymous, threatening letters legally classified the residence as defective, much like a hidden mold infestation or a cracked foundation. By pursuing this legal remedy, the Broadduses inadvertently took their intensely private nightmare and codified it into the permanent, searchable public record. The intimate details of the threats, the names of their children, and the profound terror they were experiencing were no longer confined to police files, but laid bare in civil complaints for anyone to read. This desperate bid for legal salvation would prove to be the spark that ignited an uncontrollable inferno of public attention. The moment local reporters uncovered the court filings, the narrative surrounding 657 Boulevard exploded, transforming a closely guarded suburban secret into a viral national news sensation overnight. The grotesque poetry of the Watcher's letters, now accessible to journalists, proved irresistible to the press, who descended upon the quiet streets of Westfield with satellite trucks and camera crews. Articles dissecting the Watcher house proliferated across digital media platforms, global news networks, and true crime forums, amplifying the family's trauma on an unimaginable scale. The town's carefully manicured image of safety and affluence was abruptly hijacked, replaced by a sensationalized broadcast of a faceless predator operating with absolute impunity. As the story saturated the cultural consciousness, the Broaddus family realized that exposing the monster to the light had only invited a million new eyes to watch them. The moment the lawsuit became public record, the Broaddus family's private terror was immediately commodified into a national spectacle. They had spent months fleeing the gaze of a singular, anonymous voyeur, only to find themselves thrust under the microscopic scrutiny of millions of digital spectators. News vans choked the streets of Westfield, their satellite dishes aimed at 657 Boulevard like weapons, while internet sleuths dissected the family's lives from the safety of their keyboards. This sudden exposure revealed a deeply unsettling irony within the modern true crime phenomenon. The public's appetite for real-life horror transformed a family's ongoing trauma into morbid entertainment, stripping away their humanity to serve a relentless news cycle. The Watcher had sought to control the family through fear, but the media circus achieved a similar violation, proving that society's insatiable curiosity can be just as invasive as a stalker's gaze. The digital mob's relentless appetite for details ensured that the very isolation Derek and Maria sought was permanently shattered by the mechanics of viral infamy. As the media frenzy intensified, a profoundly disturbing shift occurred within the affluent enclave of Westfield itself. Instead of rallying to protect a family under siege, the community began to turn against Derek and Maria Broaddus with striking hostility. Local residents, fiercely protective of their town's pristine reputation and the soaring property values that accompanied it, viewed the highly publicized lawsuit as an existential threat to their suburban utopia. Neighborhood meetings, once focused on block parties and school events, devolved into bitter grievance sessions where the victims were openly scrutinized. The prevailing sentiment shifted rapidly from sympathy to resentment, as neighbors argued that the Broaddus family should have simply kept quiet and absorbed the financial ruin rather than tarnishing the town's prestigious image. This collective defensive posture effectively ostracized the family, demonstrating how quickly the veneer of suburban solidarity shatters when financial interests are perceived to be at risk. To rationalize their growing animosity, the community birthed and nurtured an insidious narrative. The entire ordeal was an elaborate hoax orchestrated by the victims themselves. Local gossip mills began churning out the theory that Derek and Maria were suffering from severe buyer's remorse or sudden financial strain after purchasing the $1.3 million home. According to this localized mythology, the parents had forged the terrifying letters to legally void the sale and escape their overwhelming mortgage. This rumor spread like a contagion through country club dinners and school pickup lines, transforming the victims into calculating perpetrators in the eyes of their peers. It was a mathematically impossible theory given the timeline of the first letter, yet it thrived because it offered the neighborhood a comfortable, self-serving alternative to the terrifying reality that a predator lived among them. The manicured lawns and stately facades of the boulevard now masked a toxic environment of suspicion, where every closed door hid neighbors whispering accusations against the very people who had been targeted. Yet, the meticulous findings of both local law enforcement and private investigators systematically dismantled this convenient community fiction. Financial forensic analysis proved unequivocally that the Broaddus family was entirely solvent, easily capable of managing the mortgage without any underlying distress. Furthermore, the first chilling letter arrived before the family had even begun major renovations or encountered any unexpected costs, completely neutralizing the timeline required for buyer's remorse to take root. Detectives also noted the sheer psychological toll the ordeal had exacted on the couple, a level of profound, visible distress that no financial scam could realistically manufacture. The FBI behavioral profile further corroborated their innocence. confirming that the linguistic patterns and escalating threat level in the letters did not align with a self-authored extortion attempt. The empirical evidence overwhelmingly confirmed that the threat was genuine, yet the town's collective refusal to accept these facts highlighted a deeper, more troubling psychological barrier. The Westfield community's hostile reaction serves as a textbook manifestation of a psychological defense mechanism known as the just world hypothesis. This cognitive bias drives individuals to believe that the world is inherently fair, and therefore, people get exactly what they deserve. When confronted with the terrifying, random nature of the watcher's harassment, neighbors subconsciously needed to find a flaw in the victim's actions to reassure themselves that such a nightmare could never happen to their own families. By concluding that Derek and Maria were either fraudsters or had somehow provoked the stalker by being too ostentatious, the surrounding residents successfully insulated their own psyches from terror. Blaming the victim is rarely about malice. Rather, it is a desperate, unconscious strategy to maintain the illusion of personal safety in a chaotic and unpredictable world. This psychological armor, while comforting to the observers, inflicted a secondary trauma on the family, leaving them entirely alienated in their darkest hour. Trapped between an antagonistic community and an elusive stalker, the Broaddus family faced a catastrophic financial bleeding that could no longer be sustained. They were paying a massive monthly mortgage and exorbitant property taxes on a $1.3 million home they were too terrified to inhabit, while simultaneously hemorrhaging funds to pay for private security, forensic linguists, and a shadow investigation. The sheer economic gravity of their situation forced them into a pragmatic yet deeply terrifying decision. Unable to sell the stigmatized property without taking a ruinous loss, they resolved to put 657 Boulevard on the rental market. It was a desperate maneuver to mitigate their financial collapse, but it required them to introduce a new, unsuspecting variable into the watcher's twisted game. They were ethically and legally bound to disclose the threat to any prospective tenants, making the search for a renter a grueling test of finding someone brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to step into the crosshairs. The eventual signing of a lease shifted the dynamic of the investigation entirely, placing an entirely new family inside the walls that the anonymous author claimed to possess. A moving truck finally pulled into the driveway of 657 Boulevard, bringing not the Broaddus family, but a renter willing to brave the property's shadowed reputation. For the first few weeks, the sprawling suburban home remained utterly silent, undisturbed by the postal anomalies that had previously terrorized the address. This uninterrupted quiet bred a fragile, desperate hope within the Broaddus family, watching from afar as the days turned into weeks without incident. They began to harbor the comforting illusion that their tormentor had simply moved on, lost interest, or perhaps even passed away, leaving the house to finally exist as just a house. But this temporary reprieve was merely the calm before a highly calculated escalation. 2.5 years after the initial barrage, the silence was violently shattered when an envelope addressed simply to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife Maria appeared in the mail. However, this correspondence was not intercepted by the owners, but was instead discovered by the new renter, who suddenly found himself thrust into the center of a psychological war zone. The letter explicitly acknowledged the renter's presence, mocking the Broaddus family's attempt to circumvent the unseen guardian by bringing in a proxy. It detailed the specific movements of the new occupant, proving definitively that the surveillance of the property had never ceased, only paused its communication. This sudden intrusion forced the renter into immediate panic, entirely unraveling the fragile facade of safety that had just been constructed. Linguistic analysis of this new correspondence revealed a stark, terrifying deviation from the previous, almost theatrical persona of the territorial guardian. The prose had devolved into the frantic, vindictive ravings of a cornered animal, brimming with raw hostility and devoid of the pseudo-poetic grandiosity that marked the earlier letters. The author explicitly threatened revenge, stating that the house had rebuffed the Broaddus family and warning the renter that they were now in the crosshairs of this localized obsession. It promised physical harm, noting that the watcher had been patient, but that patience had finally evaporated into pure malice. The sheer venom of the text indicated an adversary who was no longer just watching, but actively mutating into a tangible, aggressive threat. Beyond the overt threats, the most chilling aspect of the letter was its hyper-specific knowledge of the neighborhood's internal gossip and the private rental arrangement itself. The author gloated about the community's reaction to the Broaddus family's plight, referencing private conversations and localized rumors that never made the evening news. This profound level of local awareness cemented a terrifying reality. The watcher was not a distant eccentric, but an embedded stalker, someone walking the same manicured sidewalks and attending the same neighborhood block parties. They were a ghost hiding in plain sight, perfectly camouflaged by the affluent suburban environment they claimed to protect. Realizing the threat was originating from inside the community's own perimeter, law enforcement was forced to pivot their entire investigative strategy. Detectives from the Westfield Police Department and the Union County Prosecutor's Office descended upon the surrounding streets, knocking on heavy oak doors under the guise of neighborly cooperation. They initiated a massive, unprecedented sweep, requesting voluntary DNA swabs from dozens of residents living within the immediate visual radius of the property. The objective was clinical and straightforward: obtain a genetic sample from the local populace to cross-reference against the single, female DNA profile recovered from the adhesive flap of the original envelopes. It was a desperate dragnet, hoping that the intimate proximity of the suspect would finally be their undoing through the undeniable science of genetic sequencing. Yet this forensic gamble quickly collided with the rigid protective instincts of the wealthy suburban enclave. The investigation hit an impenetrable wall when several key neighbors, individuals whose homes offered direct lines of sight to the property, flatly refused to submit their genetic material. They cited deep-seated concerns over privacy and civil liberties, slamming their doors on the very detectives trying to excise the rot from their neighborhood. This mass refusal plunged the case into an agonizing moral and investigative gray area, leaving the Broaddus family to agonizingly wonder who was simply protecting their constitutional rights and who was actively hiding a dark, obsessive secret. The silence of the neighbors became just as deafening and just as terrifying as the letters themselves. Denied the definitive proof they sought, the authorities watched their best, and perhaps last, forensic lead dissolve into the impenetrable shadows of the boulevard. The Watchers successfully outmaneuvered every tier of law enforcement, creating a masterclass in psychological evasion. Despite the combined efforts of local Westfield police, highly paid private investigators, and even former FBI profilers, the phantom stalker remained entirely elusive. Their methodology was chillingly simple, relying on the archaic anonymity of analog mail to bypass modern digital surveillance. By utilizing untracked postal routes and generic envelopes, the perpetrator severed the forensic tether that typically connects a stalker to their victim. Profilers meticulously combed through the syntax, grammar, and peculiar phrasing of the letters, searching for a psychological fingerprint that simply refused to materialize. Every behavioral model failed to predict the Watcher's next move, rendering sophisticated predictive algorithms completely useless. The analog nature of the threat neutralized the technological advantages of 21st century investigative techniques, leaving detectives chasing shadows in a digital age. The stalker had engineered a perfect, untraceable crime through sheer technological regression. The quiet, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, devoid of security cameras or digital footprints, provided the perfect, impenetrable cover for this archaic method of terror. As the technological dead ends multiplied, investigators were forced to confront a deeply unsettling hypothesis regarding the perpetrator's identity. The most disturbing theory posited that the Watcher was not a marginalized outsider, but rather a respected pillar of the Westfield community. The intimate knowledge of the home's renovations, the neighborhood's rhythms, and the town's social dynamics suggested someone deeply entrenched in the local fabric. This was someone who likely attended neighborhood barbecues, participated in town council meetings, and smiled at the Broaddus family in passing. The chilling implication was that the stalker sat invisibly among the very people ostensibly rallying to support the victims. Detectives began scrutinizing prominent figures, analyzing local board members, and reviewing attendance logs from municipal gatherings, searching for a wolf in sheep's clothing. The psychological profile shifted from a solitary deviant to an outwardly successful, deeply resentful neighbor, harboring a pathological obsession with 657 Boulevard. This theory transformed every friendly interaction in the town into a potential interrogation, poisoning the well of community trust. The resulting paranoia fractured the neighborhood, turning longtime residents against one another as the search for the hidden antagonist intensified. After 5 agonizing years of relentless psychological warfare, financial hemorrhaging, and creeping community betrayal, the Broaddus family finally capitulated. The Watcher had achieved what every stalker ultimately desires: complete and total dominance over their victims' lives. The dream of raising their children in the Grand Dutch Colonial had mutated into an inescapable, waking nightmare that eroded their mental and emotional stability. The decision to surrender the house was not merely a real estate transaction, but a profound concession to an invisible, omnipotent adversary. The family's departure marked the grim resolution of a battle they could never truly fight, much less win. The stalker's campaign of terror had successfully purged the bloodline they so vehemently despised, proving that anonymous psychological violence could indeed conquer legal ownership. The Watcher's ultimate victory exposed the terrifying fragility of the American dream, demonstrating how easily a sanctuary can be weaponized by a faceless entity. They left behind a monument to their own defeat, a house forever tainted by the obsessive gaze of a ghost. This surrender fundamentally altered the legacy of 657 Boulevard, cementing its reputation not as a coveted estate, but as a conquered territory. The profound financial scar left by the ordeal became agonizingly apparent when the property finally sold in the summer of 2019. The Broaddus family was forced to absorb a massive $400,000 loss, a devastating economic blow compounded by years of legal fees and carrying costs. The financial devastation was a secondary trauma, a tangible metric of the unseen stalker's destructive power over their livelihood. Yet the sale also introduced a perplexing new variable into the narrative: the identity and mindset of the buyers who willingly purchased the heavily stigmatized home. This young family stepped into the epicenter of a national true crime phenomenon, fully aware of the sinister legacy attached to the address. Their willingness to inhabit a space defined by psychological torture baffled outside observers and seasoned investigators alike. It required a staggering level of compartmentalization, or perhaps a profound skepticism, to sleep under the same roof that had systematically broken the previous owners. The transaction closed a painful chapter for Derek and Maria, but it opened a terrifyingly uncertain future for the brave, or perhaps naive, new occupants. The staggering financial deficit stood as the final, measurable consequence of a crime that otherwise left zero physical evidence behind. As the new family settled into the Grand Dutch Colonial, the public and the authorities braced for the inevitable resumption of the hostile correspondence. Yet, defying all psychological profiles and predictive models, an eerie, uninterrupted silence descended upon 657 Boulevard. To public knowledge, the new owners have never received a single piece of mail from the Watcher, nor have they reported any suspicious activity. This sudden cessation of hostilities is arguably more terrifying than the letters themselves, presenting a baffling behavioral anomaly that contradicts the stalker's previously established compulsion. Investigators are left to ponder the terrifying silence, dissecting the reasons behind this abrupt and unexpected peace. Did the stalker achieve their ultimate goal by ousting the Broaddus family, thereby extinguishing the obsessive drive that fueled the letters? Or is the Watcher simply biding their time, observing the new young blood from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? The absence of communication forces analysts to re-examine everything they thought they knew about the perpetrator's fundamental motivations. This profound quiet has transformed the ongoing investigation into a waiting game, fraught with the lingering dread of an unpredictable, dormant threat. The current silence at the property has spawned a myriad of competing investigative theories, each attempting to decode the psychology of the sudden cessation. One prominent hypothesis suggests that the Watcher's obsession was intrinsically tied to the Woods family, the previous owners, and the Broaddus family was merely collateral damage in a highly specific vendetta. Under this framework, the stalker's rage was triggered exclusively by Derek and Maria's extensive renovations, which were perceived as a desecration of a sacred, historical space. With the house now sold and the renovations complete, the specific psychological trigger that activated the Watcher may simply no longer exist. Conversely, another chilling theory posits that the animosity was directed entirely at Derek and Maria Broaddus themselves, driven by an intense, personal jealousy or an unknown slight. If the stalker's motivation was specifically to ruin them, the successful sale of the house at a massive loss would represent the ultimate fulfillment of that desire. Other experts suggest a more pragmatic, morbid resolution. The perpetrator may have passed away, moved out of Westfield, or become physically incapable of continuing the campaign. Regardless of the theory, the silence remains a heavy, suffocating blanket over the case, offering no true closure, only a suspended state of anxiety. The grand facade of the house now stands quietly in the Westfield twilight, holding its secrets tight, a silent monument to an unsolved and dormant mystery. The psychological toll inflicted upon Derek and Maria Broaddus transcends typical victimhood, firmly rooting itself in the clinical concept of ambiguous loss. Unlike a traditional crime scene marked by shattered glass or physical violence, the violation at 657 Boulevard left no tangible debris to sweep away. The trauma was invisible, an insidious dread that permeated their daily lives without offering a definitive event to mourn or process. This unique form of psychological torture stems from the lack of closure, a perpetual state of hypervigilance where the threat remains omnipresent yet entirely unseen. Psychologists note that victims of such profound, unresolved harassment often suffer from severe anxiety and paranoia, their minds constantly attempting to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. For the Broaddus family, the perpetrator was simultaneously nowhere and everywhere, transforming every passing car and neighborly glance into a potential source of malice. Navigating this unseen terror ultimately forced the family to abandon their sanctuary, illustrating how psychological warfare can systematically dismantle a household without a single physical blow. The Watcher case brutally exposes the deep, unsettling fragility of the suburban American dream, shattering the illusion that wealth and manicured lawns provide an impenetrable shield against the dark. It is profoundly disturbing to realize that an idyllic life, painstakingly built and heavily financed, can be utterly annihilated by a few sheets of paper costing mere cents in postage. The profound terror lies not in a violent home invasion, but in the quiet, calculated dismantling of a family's fundamental sense of security, proving that true vulnerability exists even behind the most affluent doors. That shattered illusion catalyzed a lasting shift in how prospective homeowners approach the real estate market, fundamentally altering the legal expectations of property disclosure. Buyers across the country began demanding explicit, written guarantees regarding a property's psychological history, unwilling to rely solely on standard structural inspections. Real estate attorneys observed a distinct surge in inquiries regarding stigmatized properties, forcing the industry to grapple with the legal liabilities of undisclosed threats. The Watcher had effectively weaponized the mail, and in doing so, permanently injected a layer of profound suspicion into the previously routine process of purchasing a family home. Beyond the legal ramifications, the human aftermath left a permanent scar on the Westfield community, forever altering its reputation as a serene, impenetrable haven. Neighbors who once shared casual greetings over pristine hedges now viewed each other through a lens of quiet suspicion, acutely aware that a predator might reside among them. The relentless media circus that descended upon the town only exacerbated this communal trauma, transforming private residents into unwilling characters in a global true crime spectacle. For the locals, the legacy of 657 Boulevard became a cautionary tale about the dark voyeurism of the digital age, where a neighborhood's collective nightmare was consumed as mere entertainment by millions. This intense public fascination culminated in late 2022, when a major streaming platform released a dramatized series based on the events in Westfield, New Jersey. The production fundamentally shifted the narrative from a localized police investigation into an international pop culture phenomenon, drawing an unprecedented wave of amateur sleuths to the quiet suburban street. Authorities were forced to erect barricades and deploy additional patrols simply to manage the influx of tourists attempting to photograph the infamous residence. The true crime industrial complex had effectively amplified the original harassment, proving that the modern consumption of tragedy often inflicts secondary trauma on the very communities it seeks to depict. Amidst the glaring spotlight of international attention, the physical environment of the investigation still harbors one glaring, unresolved anomaly that defies forensic explanation. The DNA extracted from the envelopes belonging to an unknown female has never been matched to any suspect, neighbor, or known associate despite exhaustive database searches. This microscopic trace of genetic material lingers like a ghost over the entire case file, a silent witness that refuses to yield its secrets. Whether it belongs to a primary conspirator, a hired accomplice, or simply a postal worker who inadvertently contaminated the evidence, remains a chilling void in the official record. The enduring mystery of that genetic profile highlights a profound limitation in the modern criminal justice system, demonstrating that even advanced forensic technology cannot always conquer human cunning. Law enforcement agencies are increasingly forced to acknowledge that sophisticated psychological terrorism can effectively outmaneuver traditional evidence-gathering protocols. As digital communication becomes more secure, the regression to untraceable, analog threats like handwritten letters presents a formidable challenge to modern investigative frameworks. The Westfield case stands as a stark institutional reminder that the most terrifying predators often operate within the analog shadows, entirely bypassing the digital tripwires established by contemporary police work. For the Broaddus family, the ultimate consequence was a forced exile from the life they had meticulously planned, culminating in a devastating financial and emotional capitulation. The eventual sale of the property at a massive loss was not merely a real estate transaction, but a definitive surrender to an unseen, unconquered adversary. They were compelled to rebuild their lives in the shadow of an unsolved psychological assault, carrying the invisible weight of a stalker who was never unmasked. Their forced retreat underscores a disturbing reality, proving that sometimes the justice system fails entirely, leaving victims to absorb the profound cost of their own survival. The broader implication of this unresolved terror is a chilling realization that true anonymity is still weaponizable in an increasingly surveilled world. The Watcher successfully demonstrated that an individual can dismantle a family, paralyze a police department, and captivate a nation without ever stepping into the light. This chilling success story continues to resonate through the annals of modern true crime, fundamentally altering our perception of suburban safety. The ultimate horror of 657 Boulevard is not just what was written in those letters, but the enduring, terrifying fact that the author simply walked away, vanishing back into the quiet, manicured streets of America. Despite years of exhaustive forensic analysis and neighborhood sweeps, the origin of the female DNA extracted from the flap of the first envelope remains a glaring, unresolved anomaly. This single microscopic trace represents a profound failure of modern investigative techniques when confronted with an adversary who leaves no digital footprint and operates entirely in the analog shadows. The implication is terrifying, suggesting the perpetrator either possessed an accomplice completely insulated from the primary investigation, or the forensic profile itself belongs to an innocent bystander, a postal worker, or a complete stranger unwittingly weaponized to obscure the truth. This lingering biological phantom ensures that the psychological terror inflicted upon the Broaddus family can never truly be neutralized. Every passing stranger, every neighbor who matches the vague demographic profile, becomes a vessel for that unidentified DNA, transforming a quiet suburban enclave into an enduring landscape of suspicion. The case record stands open, a testament to the chilling reality that some malevolent actors do not need brilliance to evade capture, only the discipline to exploit the simplest, most archaic methods of psychological warfare. The enduring legacy of the Westfield letters catalyzed a tangible shift in real estate jurisprudence, fundamentally altering how psychological stigmas are treated in property transactions. In the aftermath of the failed civil litigation initiated by the Broaddus family, the legal threshold for what constitutes a material defect was scrutinized, exposing a severe gap in seller disclosure requirements. The terrifying ambiguity of a stalker, once considered an intangible nuisance outside the purview of physical property damage, forced legal scholars to reevaluate the definition of a safe habitation. Consequently, regional real estate protocols began incorporating more stringent language regarding latent psychological defects, compelling sellers to disclose non-physical threats that could severely impact a property's value and the safety of its occupants. This institutional adjustment acts as a permanent procedural scar left by the Watcher, ensuring that future buyers are legally shielded from inheriting a legacy of anonymous terror. The legal framework itself had to evolve, acknowledging that a house can be structurally sound, yet fundamentally uninhabitable due to the invisible poison of targeted malice. For the Broaddus family, the aftermath is measured not just in staggering financial loss, but in the permanent fracturing of their foundational sense of security. They were forced to abandon their idyllic vision of suburban life, retreating to a heavily fortified residence far from the architectural grandeur of 657 Boulevard. The psychological toll of navigating constant surveillance, paralyzing paranoia, and the bitter betrayal of a community that turned against them forged an enduring trauma that no geographic relocation could fully erase. The town of Westfield itself was irrevocably altered, the pristine facade of its affluent neighborhood stained by a persistent localized paranoia. Trust among neighbors evaporated, replaced by the installation of high-definition security cameras and the silent, suspicious observation of passing vehicles and late-night pedestrians. The communal atmosphere of open doors and twilight block parties was quietly dismantled, leaving behind an environment where every resident subconsciously monitors the shadows, acutely aware that safety in an affluent zip code is merely an illusion. This localized tragedy exposes a much broader, systemic vulnerability within the architecture of modern society, highlighting the terrifying efficacy of analog terrorism in a hyper-digital age. While law enforcement agencies have spent decades perfecting the extraction of digital metadata, internet protocols, and cellular triangulation, they remain profoundly unequipped to dismantle a threat delivered through handwritten letters and traditional postage. The Watcher phenomenon dismantled the contemporary assumption that all modern criminals leave a digital wake, proving that profound psychological devastation can still be orchestrated using nothing more than a pen, paper, and a hauntingly intimate knowledge of a victim's daily routine. Even now, as new occupants walk the polished hardwood floors of 657 Boulevard, the heavy, ornate front door stands as a silent sentinel to a mystery that refuses to die. Deep within the architecture, behind the walls where the anonymous author claimed to be hiding, the house retains its secrets, waiting in the quiet dark while the mail continues to arrive.